You're speaking my language. It's something we've likely heard or said somewhere along the way. You're speaking my language. What are we saying when we find ourselves saying that? Or when we say it to a speaker or to a preacher, I felt like in that room of 400 people, you were talking just to me. What am I saying to a preacher or a teacher or a speaker when I said, gosh, it felt like you were talking right to me? Or when we hear people talk about soulmates. Soulmates. What are they saying? What we are saying is that that person gets us. He or she knows what I mean. They know and understand what I'm trying to say. They understand me. They understand something of my perspective, where I'm coming from in my life, perhaps even my suffering, that somehow we're aligned here. There's this felt connection. We're expressing ourselves in similar ways. Or maybe it's what we also mean when we say, I think we're on the same wavelength. You heard about it in the Acts of the Apostles in that first reading this morning. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven staying in Jerusalem. At the sound they gathered in a crowd, but they were confused, because each one heard them speaking in his own native language. They were astounded, and in amazement they asked, are not all these people who are speaking Galileans? Then how does each of us hear them in his native tongue? My gosh, he goes on to say, we're Parthians and Medes and Elamites. We're from Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, on and on. We're all travelers from Rome, but Jews and converts to Jerusalem, Cretans, Arabs, and yet we hear them speaking our own language of the mighty acts of God. You're speaking my language. What I hear happening in this world is more often than not, it seems, anything but that. We don't hear people speak in our language. What I hear rather is that we're not taking the time to even try to understand what others are saying. We are so quick to disagree and come out with the full force of our disagreement. And sometimes those disagreements quickly turn into anger of its own, a firmness that seems unnecessary. Our preconceived ideas keep us from understanding each other first. We never get to the question of why did she say that? Where is he coming from in that faith perhaps, or in that opinion, or in the way they're acting? I wonder why. Instead, our reaction certainly says that I do not understand what you are saying, or that you're wrong, or that my opinion matters more than our connection right now. And we certainly are not getting each other. For example, when we do couples counseling for marriage preparation here at the CSC, it's not unusual that couples come with different faiths from each other, even within the same tradition. It's not unusual that they end up arguing about those beliefs. And what I try to tell them, what we try to work with them toward, is that their first job is not to stay up here on the level of ideas, but to drop through what they believe, what they assume to be true, to their heart, to listen. Not so much to the idea at first, but to the heart of the person who's sharing that idea. Get from that idea to his or her heart. Get to know the person who holds that faith more than getting to know the articles of that faith. But it's on any number of issues. It's not just about faith. And the truth is, in any good marriage, any good friendship, our first responsibility is to know the person through what they hold to be true up here. And if we just keep staying up here, we'll never get to know the person who holds to that. I was with a family last night of 4 children. I think they have 4. And I was noticing how differently the parents respond to each of the kids. It's like each of the 4 kids, and they're older now, they're mostly teenagers, early college, some post-college even. But to each of their children, the parents talked a little bit differently. It's like they knew the language that kid needed to hear, and the connection was to that one. It wasn't one-size-fits-all language. It's pretty amazing to see that happening in front of my own eyes. Things are so different when we take some time to listen to each other. Really, they are. If we take the time to listen to each other and find out what those things, those words even mean to that person, to him or to her, and then try to say to them what I want to say in a way that will make sense to them. In a way that will make sense to them. One of the mistakes I keep hearing the church make is that we try to talk to the whole world with the same language. And what I hear our Holy Father Pope Francis trying to say these days, especially in his last apostolic exhortation, is everybody doesn't talk the same language. Everybody has their own experiences of suffering and loss and hurt and limitation, and so we have to let people hear what we're saying in their own language that makes them think, perhaps. Try to say it in a way that makes sense to them. It's extra work to do that. But this would be a new Pentecost, and we would be speaking in tongues. We would be speaking a language this Pentecost that people need to hear instead of what we want them to hear all the time. This would be true in our families. What our Holy Father again is saying again and again these last 2 years is families need a new Pentecost. They need a new Pentecost, but they're not the only ones. Church communities need a new Pentecost. Our universities need a new Pentecost. Our cities need a new Pentecost. The language between nations needs a new Pentecost because we keep wanting to force people to hear it our way in our language and do it our way, and we don't ever listen first to what they need, what they're saying they need. Not that we don't ever, but we try not to. I have to stop right here for a second and acknowledge that Kevin O'Malley came back home this week. Gosh, I wasn't going to do this in the middle of my homily, Kevin, but since you are somebody who has to work at speaking the language of other nations, Kevin is from the CSC. This was his home parish. When he was in town, he was appointed, and now he's the ambassador to Ireland. And it's great to have him home. He gave a great talk yesterday at St. Louis University to 10,000 people. Kevin, would you stand up? Welcome home, buddy. Good to have you back. I will never talk to 10,000 people. But I have to say, when I had the opportunity to go to Northern Ireland with him at the beginning of last summer, and that's exactly what he was trying to do with them. But it has to happen with the person who's sitting right in front of me, too. It's just really important that we get to that. We must learn to listen now so that we begin to speak to one another and find the words to speak that will resonate with this other human being, resonate with their life, the way they hear, the words they use. The CSC has to do this all the time. I'm 65. The students I'm loving are 18. This is a big difference. And I have to learn their vocabulary, their experience, what matters to them. I can't just talk to them about what matters to me. I've tried. Isn't any wonder that there's such a rejoicing, Such a rejoicing on that first Pentecost when people, every person, had a sense that these apostles and these disciples of this teacher, Jesus, who were so different than they were from all over the world, were speaking their language, their own language. Are we surprised then that people were burning inside with love that day? Wow! Somebody took the time to understand me and to get me. They were burning inside with love, brimming over with enthusiasm. That there was such an electricity that day in the air, a fire in them just then. We can hear almost anything when we first feel understood. We can hear almost anything anybody will say to us when we feel like they took the time to understand us first. And we can even change our mind after that. This was a new way. This was a new way they were experiencing for the first time. And so people were converting in droves to this way of life, this new way of communicating and talking. And I say way of life with a capital W because it was just after this Pentecost day that they began to call these followers of Jesus a people of the way, because this was a new way of life they had never seen before. This was indeed the people of the way they were joining, a whole new way to be together, a whole new way to connect through understanding first, and compassion first, and genuine dialogue second, that listens before we speak and tries to communicate in a way the other person understands. This would be a new Pentecost for families and for religious communities. This would be a new Pentecost for the church and for the world. You see, this is how God speaks to us. God speaks our language all the time. God meets people where they are in a way that hits to the heart. The Lord makes his teaching so personal to me and to you and to each of us, in such a way that speaking our own language, meeting each of us where we are, right where we are, becomes a way for me to finally hear what God is saying. And I'd propose to you this morning, this Pentecost, that I don't know that we can get to this way of talking to each other without a higher power, this Holy Spirit of God. I don't know if we can get to this new way, get back to this way, without a higher power, higher than our own ego. Something has to be bigger than our ego. And it can only happen with people who let themselves have this sort of higher consciousness from there, who see the world from a whole new place and listen and speak from that consciousness, to get underneath their ideas to whatever they are saying really deep down inside, and who they are and why they're holding to that. It takes time. You know it who are married. If you're going to get to this, it takes time. It takes a desire to learn what makes people tick, including your spouse, and why or what from their life led them to that conclusion or assumption they carry, however crazy it might sound to me. In the words of St. Francis's prayer, you know them as well as I do I have it in me to seek to understand before I seek to be understood? Lord, grant me the ability to seek to understand rather than be understood. That could be a mantra for life for each of us, without exception. A quick story I read not too long ago about a mom who was versed in theology, as she had studied theology, and she and her kids were invited to a church very different from her own. It was a Pentecostal church, and her kids had never experienced anything like that, and she had rarely. So they went all together to this Pentecostal church, and on their way home, they started talking about what they experienced there, and immediately they were criticizing everything they saw and heard, criticizing the craziness of all these people, the length of the service, all that emotion in church, and on and on. And the mom joined right in, and here's why they do what they do, but we kind of got it right, was what she was inferring, and their theology's wrong, and ours is right, and a teachable moment for a parent about why they should stay Catholic. And then it hit the mom right between the eyes. Right between the eyes. That what's happening in that car on the way home is what we do to each other all the time. And so she paused for a second and she said, you know, what did you like about what happened there? And there was dead silence in the car. What did you like there? What was good? And then they started talking. Well, they talked about what they liked about what happened there. And they ended up having this really moment of gratitude for what they had just experienced. I think that mom was on to something. We don't just do it about worship in a church, but we do it within our own church all the time. We also do it about how we raise our kids. We're so critical about how other people don't do it like we think they should. We complain about how lax they are, that their kids are undisciplined, how they treat, and we also complain about how people treat their spouses, not having a clue what's going on in that relationship. And we'll see it often this year, I'm sure, as we make this run to the White House. But if we don't start doing that for each other, stepping outside our way of seeing by listening to others first, really listening, then we'll never begin to speak their language, and nothing will ever change. Pentecost says we can do this. My friends, Pentecost says we can do this. We are equipped to do this. We are equipped to meet people where they are, and God has given us the gift of tongues. God has given each of us the gift of tongues to enable us to say it in a way that can connect with people first, speak their language, even more, help them feel understood. But when we do get to that, oh my gosh, wonderful things begin to happen around your dinner table and in our schools and between nations and in our friendships. Wonderful things begin to happen. Pentecost begins to happen. With all my heart, I want us to be someone about whom someone would say what the crowd said that day in Jerusalem. Oh my gosh, she's speaking my language. It seems like he's talking just to me.